Now, the rest of the story. Oklahoma was some 30 years from statehood when Laban Miles arrived in the Osage Hills. He came as a federal supervisor of the Osage Indian lands. They called them Indian agents in those days, a corrupt bunch, many of them, and yet in an effort to curb the corruption, President Ulysses Grant had begun appointing Quakers to such positions. Not only were the Quakers honest, but ever since the times of William Penn, Native Americans seemed to respect Quakers more than other white men. And so it was that in 1878, President Grant appointed a Quaker named Laban Miles as an agent for the Osage. The government agency in that territory was far removed from so-called civilization, but Laban liked it just fine. He'd always been sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans, and now he had the opportunity to make a difference in their destiny. So he counseled the Osage, not in English, as many had tried before. He counseled them in their own language, and he was also completely tolerant of the Osage religion, unlike innumerable agents before him. And then when oil was found on tribal land, Laban Miles fought to preserve the rights of the Osage in regard to the recovery of any profits therefrom. In fact, Laban J. Miles became so revered, so beloved by the Osage, that at least one Native American author dedicated a book on Osage history to Laban Miles. Laban's compassion and sense of responsibility to the Osage manifested themselves in his private life as well. For while children of the white man's world were reading youth magazines featuring wild Indian stories, Laban forbade his own youngsters to peruse such literature, and that restriction also applied to Laban's nephew Bert, who had been sent by his family to live at the Osage Agency for a year or so. In fact, the relationship of Bert and his idealistic Uncle Laban is the rest of the story, for Bert was orphaned at 9. And so with no father to guide him, Laban Miles became a profound influence in the boy's life, as did the Osage themselves. Native American children became his playmates, taught Bert how to make campfires and shoot arrows with a bow and walk barefoot safely through the woods. Oh, it was a magical time for the Iowa-born youngster, a benchmark in his life, he would declare through later years. And so it must have been, for history records, that when Herbert Clark Hoover ran for president in 1928, he selected as his running mate an Osage Indian. And when Hoover became president, he fought long and hard for the rights of Native Americans, even against considerable political pressure. But now as you read the pro-Indian inclinations of our 31st president in the history books, you'll recall the small orphan boy named Bert, from whom that president grew, and the wonderful, wondrous year he spent among the Osage, and the legacy of a Quaker gentleman named Laban Miles, who saw Native Americans as friends, as neighbors, as relatives. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Herbert Hoover is among several presidents who are often overlooked, which is unfortunate. Hoover is sometimes remembered as a failure, sometimes as an idiot. Some of his decisions in regard to the Great Depression were certainly questionable, but a failure? An idiot? Let's take a closer look at the man. Herbert Clark Hoover was born in this house on August 10, 1874. This is in West Branch, Iowa. His father, Jesse, owned a farm implement store and was also a blacksmith. His mother's name was Huldah. He had an older brother named Theodore and eventually a younger sister named May. Jesse and Huldah were Quakers. Family and friends knew Herbert Hoover as Bertie. In 1880, Bertie's father died from a sudden heart attack at the young age of 34. Just 4 years later, his mother, Huldah, died from typhoid fever. In 1885, Bertie and his brother and sister were sent to Newberg, Oregon to live with their uncle, a Quaker physician and businessman named John Minthorn. In addition to being a physician, Uncle John managed a real estate office called the Oregon Land Company. 13-year-old Bertie dropped out of school to work, with Uncle John's land company. It was while employed there that Bertie befriended the Osage Indians, as Mr. Harvey explained. In 1891, Bertie enrolled at the brand new Stanford University. He initially studied mechanical engineering, but changed his major to geology after working with John Casper Branner, the chairman of Stanford's geology department. Although shy, Bertie was elected as student treasurer. It was his first election win. In 1894, Lou Henry attended a geology lecture by John Casper Branner. She was an outgoing, strong-minded 20-year-old woman. She was hooked by Branner's lecture and enrolled at Stanford. There, she met Bertie, and the two became inseparable. In 1898, Lou became the first woman to earn a degree in geology from Stanford. She was the first woman in the United States to hold such a degree. A year after her graduation, Bertie and Lou married. Soon thereafter, Bertie accepted a position as leading engineer in a private Chinese engineering and mining company. The newlyweds packed their meager belongings and moved to China. In June 1900, the Boxer Rebellion caught the Hoovers in Tientsin. The Boxer Rebellion was an anti-foreign, anti-imperialist, and anti-Christian uprising in North China between 1899 and 1901 by the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known as the Boxers in English, due to many of its members having practiced Chinese martial arts, which at the time were referred to as Chinese boxing. For almost a month, Tientsin was under heavy fire. While Lou worked in the hospitals, Bertie directed the building of barricades. On July 14, 1901, a multinational military force defeated the Boxers in the Battle of Tientsin. After the rebellion, Bertie and Lou moved to London, where Bertie specialized in fixing failing mining companies. Rather than being paid a salary, Bertie agreed to take a percentage of the profits if he was able to rejuvenate the companies. Within a short time, Bertie had investments in mines on every continent and had offices in several countries. His talents as a geologist quickly made him wealthy. By 1914, Bertie's wealth reached approximately $4 million. That would be over $125 million in today's money. Bertie wrote the book on mining. Seriously, in 1909 he published a book called Principles of Mining, which became a standard textbook for geologists. In his book, Bertie endorsed organized labor and an 8-hour workday. Bertie and Lou were huge fans of Georgius Agricola's 16th century work on mining and metallurgy called De Re Metallica. Not that Metallica. In 1912, they published the first English translation of De Re Metallica. At about the same time, Bertie joined the Board of Trustees at his alma mater, Stanford. Bertie was happy with the trajectory of his life. Then something happened which forever changed the trajectory of his life. In 1914, Germany declared war on France. The American Consul General asked for Bertie's help in getting stranded American tourists back home. With the backing of Congress and President Wilson, Bertie was selected as the committee's chairman. He immediately took action. Within 2 weeks, his committee helped somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 Americans return to the United States. Sources vary on the exact number. Bertie said later, "I did not realize it at the moment, but on August 3rd, 1914, my career was over forever. I was on the slippery road of public life." In August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, which created a food crisis. Germany refused to take responsibility to feed citizens in captured territory. At this point, the United States was still neutral in what was the early part of World War I. Something had to be done. With the cooperation of President Wilson's administration, Bertie led a Belgian relief organization called the Commission for Relief in Belgium. Bertie made 40 trips to meet with German authorities in the North Sea and persuaded them to allow food shipments. Under Bertie's leadership, the Commission delivered millions of tons of foodstuffs to Belgium. In 1915, the Commission expanded and delivered supplies to people in the German-occupied northern France. American diplomat Walter Page said Bertie was probably the only man living who has privately negotiated understandings with the British, French, German, Dutch, and Belgian governments. Remember, Bertie held no political office at the time. When the United States entered World War I, President Wilson remembered how well Bertie had handled the Commission for Relief in Belgium and France and appointed him to head the U.S. Food Administration. Bertie's Herculean task was to manage the country's food supplies during the war. To avoid rationing, which other wartime countries were forced to undertake, Bertie established set days for people to avoid eating certain foods, such as meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and others with less memorable titles. The plan worked and allowed the Food Administration to send food to allies of the United States. Bertie was referred to as an expert administrator for his work, which earned him great acclaim despite his orders that he would not be named in publicity for the program. After the war, Europe still faced food shortages. The Food Administration, whose name changed to the American Relief Administration, provided food to Central and Eastern Europe. Bertie also founded the European Children's Fund to provide food and aid to some 15 million children from 14 countries. Before World War I, no one considered Herbert Hoover a candidate for any office, much less the presidency of the United States. His selfless work during the war made him a public hero. He was praised for his service as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Warren G. Harding and Silent Cal Coolidge, which allowed him to become the Republican presidential nominee in 1928. On Election Day, Bertie won by a landslide. He won 444 of the 531 electoral votes. Bertie, well, I probably should call him Herbert Hoover now, took office on March the 4th, 1929. 8 months later, the most devastating stock market crash in our country's history happened. The Great Depression followed. Despite his best efforts, the economy failed to recover. Hoover suffered an overwhelming defeat in the 1932 election. Because of the stock market crash and Great Depression which followed, Hoover is largely considered a failure. This man went from being an orphan to a multimillionaire by his own determination. He helped feed millions of people during World War I. So now, let's talk about that again. Should we consider Hoover a failure? An idiot? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.